For 7 millennia, the Veltareth Empire had painted the galaxy crimson with conquest. Their crystal-hulled dreadnoughts carved through star systems like scythes through wheat, leaving behind nothing but stripped worlds and the echoing silence of extinct civilizations. The Veltareth were perfection incarnate, 12 feet of bioengineered muscle wrapped in living armor that could regenerate from plasma burns in seconds. Their warriors, the Corvainteth, had never known defeat. Fleet Marshal Zendareth stood on the obsidian bridge of his flagship Eternal Dominion, watching another world burn. The Quillari had lasted 3 days, longer than most. Their crystalline cities now bled molten rivers into poisoned seas, another trophy in the Empire's endless expansion. "Status report," Zendareth commanded, his voice resonating through the bio-neural link that connected all Veltareth in perfect unity. "Sector 7 Prime pacified, Fleet Marshal," responded War Conductor Mir Galan, her scarred face betraying no emotion. "The Quillari archives have been absorbed. Their technology was inadequate." Zendareth's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Inadequate. The word that had described every species they'd encountered across their 7,000-year reign. The Veltareth had evolved beyond the need for fear, beyond the weakness of doubt. They were the galaxy's apex predators, and every other species existed only to feed their endless appetite for dominion. The tactical display shimmered to life, revealing their next target, a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The preliminary scans were curious. The inhabitants called themselves humans, and they possessed something that made Zendareth's combat-enhanced instincts twitch with interest: nuclear weapons. Primitive, but effective. "Tell me about these." "Humans," Zendareth ordered. Mir Galen's claws danced across the bio-console, summoning data streams. Carbon-based bipeds, short-lived, fragmented into tribal nation-states despite achieving spaceflight. They've had nuclear capability for less than a century, yet they've somehow avoided self-extinction. Her tone carried the faintest hint of puzzlement. Unusual but hardly threatening, Zendareth studied the data flowing through his neural interface. The humans were indeed primitive. No energy shields, no plasma weaponry, no bio-enhancement. They relied on crude chemical rockets and metal projectiles. Their largest vessels were barely the size of a Veltareth patrol craft. Estimated resistance. "Duration?" he asked. 6 hours, perhaps less. Their military appears chaotic. No unified command structure, no standardized technology. They even fight among themselves. Mir Galen's mandibles clicked in what passed for Veltareth amusement. "Should we even bother with a full fleet engagement?" Zendareth considered this. The Veltareth had protocols. Every species deserved the honor of facing their full might, if only to make their submission absolute. But these humans seemed so pathetically weak that sending the entire 7th Fleet might be wasteful. "Deploy 3 hunter-killer squadrons," he decided. "Standard pacification protocol. We'll make it quick." As the massive fleet began its approach to the Sol system, Zendareth felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded each conquest. Soon, Earth would join the countless worlds that had fallen before Veltareth might. Another species would learn the futility of resistance against perfection. He had no way of knowing that in a bunker beneath Geneva, a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing its own kind was about to teach the galaxy's apex predators what true warfare looked like. The humans were waiting. Admiral Kestra Voidborn stood in the war room of the Terran Defense Command, her augmented, eyes processing data streams faster than any baseline human could follow. The approaching alien fleet had been detected 3 days ago, and humanity had spent every second since then preparing for what every military analyst agreed would be a slaughter. "Status report," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had clawed her way up from the asteroid mining colonies to command Earth's defense. General Rakesh Nightfall head of Terra's combined military forces, activated the holographic display. Alien fleet is holding position at Neptune's orbit. 37 vessels, all significantly larger than our largest dreadnoughts. Energy readings are unprecedented. Kestra studied the formation. The alien ships were beautiful in a terrifying way, organic curves that suggested they were grown, rather than built, pulsing with an inner light that spoke of technologies humanity could barely comprehend. "Have they made any attempt at communication?" she asked. "Negative, but we've been monitoring their transmissions." Dr. Lyra Doomwhisper, Earth's leading xenolinguist, stepped forward. "We've managed to decrypt some basic concepts. They call themselves Veltareth. From what we can gather, they've been collecting civilizations for thousands of years." The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implication. "Collecting," Kestra repeated flatly. "Their databases contain records of over 40,000 extinct species," Doomwhisper continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. "Each one conquered, studied, and archived." "Well," said General Nightfall, his scarred face creasing into what might have been a smile, "at least we know what we're dealing with." The tactical display updated as new intelligence flowed in. The alien vessels were moving, 3 smaller groups breaking off from the main fleet and heading toward Earth. Their formation was perfect, their approach methodical. The behavior of predators who had never known defeat. "They're not sending their full fleet," observed Commander Zephyr Ironclad from the Luna defense grid. "Arrogant bastards think 3 squadrons are enough." Kestra's enhanced mind was already running calculations. The approaching alien force still outgunned humanity's entire space navy by a factor of 10, but there was something in their casual approach that sparked a dangerous hope. The Veltareth had made their first mistake. They were underestimating their prey. "All stations go to condition black," she ordered. "Activate the Damocles Protocol." Around the room, faces hardened. The Damocles Protocol was humanity's last resort, a strategy born from centuries of warfare that had taught them one fundamental truth. If you can't match your enemy's strength, you change the rules of the game. "Admiral," General Nightfall said quietly, "are we really going to—" "We're going to show them what humans do when cornered," Kestra interrupted. "Signal all defense platforms, prepare for asymmetric engagement, and get me aligned to every government on Earth." As the alien squadrons approached, humanity's leaders gathered in emergency session. For the first time in decades, the fractured nations of Earth spoke with one voice. The message was simple: we will not go quietly into the dark. The Veltareth war conductor Thex Miran led the first squadron, his bioenhanced senses already anticipating victory. The human vessels were deploying, pathetic metal constructs that looked more like industrial equipment than warships. This would be over quickly. He opened a channel to the planet below, speaking in the crude human language his neural implants had decoded. "Humans of Earth," his voice boomed across every frequency, "you stand before the might of the Veltareth Empire. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Resist, and we will make your species extinct slowly." The response came from Admiral Voidborn herself, her voice carrying across space with unwavering defiance. "Veltareth Empire, this is Admiral Kestra Voidborn of the Terran Defense Force. You have made one critical error in your calculations." "And what is that, primitive? You assumed we wanted to win." "War conductor." Thex Miran's confusion lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Long enough for humanity to demonstrate why they had survived their own nuclear age. The first human ships didn't engage. Instead, they scattered like prey animals, their crude drives pushing them in seemingly random directions. Thex Miran's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The humans were fleeing, as expected. He ordered his squadron to pursue, the hunt beginning. Then the space around his vessels erupted. Hidden throughout the asteroid belt, Humanity had spent decades placing automated weapons platforms, not sophisticated energy weapons or plasma cannons, but something far more dangerous: nuclear-tipped kinetic projectiles launched by magnetic accelerators, thousands of them, moving at significant fractions of light speed. The Veltareth shields absorbed the nuclear explosions easily, but the kinetic impact of tungsten rods moving at 0.2 C was another matter entirely. The Crimson Harvest shuddered. As its biohull cracked, regenerative systems struggling to keep pace with the damage. "Report!" Thexmiran snarled. "Massive kinetic bombardment," his sensor operator replied, confusion bleeding through the neural link. "They're using primitive nuclear explosives as propellant charges." Thexmiran's enhanced mind processed this. The humans weren't trying to penetrate Veltareth shields with their explosives. They were using them to accelerate solid projectiles to incredible velocities, crude but effective, evasive maneuvers, close to effective weapons range. The Veltareth squadron advanced, weathering the bombardment. Their superior technology would prevail once they could bring their plasma arrays to bear. But as they closed the distance, the human ships began to behave even more strangely. The human vessel UTS Defiance suddenly changed course, heading directly for the Veltareth flagship. Thexmiran's sensors detected massive energy buildup within the crude human vessel. "They're overloading their reactor," his tactical officer reported. "Deliberately." The realization hit Thexmiran like a physical blow. The humans weren't trying to win. They were trying to take as many Veltareth with them as possible. The Defiant struck his flagship's shields and detonated in a fusion fireball that sent cracks racing through the biohull. But that was just the beginning. Across the solar system, every human civilian ship, cargo hauler, and mining vessel was accelerating toward the Veltareth fleet. Each one had been rigged with every nuclear weapon its crew could acquire, turning ordinary merchant vessels into guided fusion bombs. On Earth, Admiral Voidborn watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. Phase 2. Initiate. The Luna. Defense grid activated. Not the weapon systems the Veltareth had detected, but something far more insidious. Humanity had spent 50 years seeding space around Earth with what appeared to be simple communication satellites. In reality, they were components of the largest minefield in human history. Each satellite contained a fusion warhead and a simple proximity sensor. As the Veltareth advanced, they found space itself turning hostile. Every few thousand kilometers, another nuclear explosion would detonate, not enough to penetrate their shields individually, but creating a constant barrage that taxed their defensive systems. Thexmiran realized with growing horror that the humans weren't fighting a battle. They were fighting a war. Every ship, every station, every piece of floating debris had been weaponized. The solar system had become a trap, and the Veltareth had walked into it willingly. "Fall back to the outer system," he ordered. "Regroup and—" His words were cut off as space around his squadron lit up with new contacts. Human ships were emerging from behind asteroids, from the shadows of moons, from hiding places that should have been impossible to conceal vessels in. Each one was accelerating toward his forces, reactor signatures climbing toward critical overload. The humans had turned their entire star system into a weapon, and they were willing to die to use it. For the first time in 7,000 years, a Veltareth war conductor felt something his species had evolved beyond. Thexmiran felt fear. Fleet Marshal Zendareth watched the tactical display with mounting disbelief as his 3 squadrons, veteran units that had conquered solar systems, struggled against what should have been primitive prey. The neural link carried confused reports from his commanders, fragments of horror that painted an impossible picture. "They're in the asteroids!" War Conductor Thexmiran's transmission crackled with static. "Every rock, every piece of debris. They've weaponized everything. Sir, they're not trying to defeat us. They're trying to—" The link went dead as another human ship detonated against the squadron's shields, the fusion blast bright enough to briefly blind the sensors. "Bring the fleet forward." Zendareth commanded. "Full engagement." "Sir." Mir Galen's scarred features showed the first uncertainty Zendareth had ever seen from his war conductor. "Perhaps we should request reinforcements. These humans fight differently. Differently." The word tasted like poison in Zendareth's mind. The Veltareth had perfected warfare across 7 millennia of conquest. They had developed strategies to counter every form of resistance, every type of military doctrine. But the humans weren't following any doctrine. They were improvising. As the main Veltareth fleet advanced into the inner system, they encountered Earth's true defense, not its military, but its people. Every orbital habitat had been rigged with nuclear charges. Every asteroid mining facility had been converted into a kinetic bombardment platform. The humans had spent generations learning to live in the hostile environment of space, and now they were using that knowledge to turn space itself into a weapon. The merchant ship Stellar Wind had been a grain hauler 2 days ago. Now it was a guided missile carrying enough fusion warheads to crack a moon. Captain Rex Starfall and his crew of 12 had volunteered for the mission, knowing they wouldn't return. "Target acquired," reported his navigator, Engineer Mona Blazeheart. "Veltareth Dreadnought, bearing 27 Mark 4. "All hands, this is the captain," Rex announced over the ship's intercom. "It's been an honor serving with you. Tell them we were here." The Stellar Wind accelerated toward the massive alien vessel, her crew singing an old mining song as they rode their ship into eternity. The explosion that followed took out the Dreadnought's entire starboard weapon array and sent shockwaves through the Veltareth fleet. But even as human ships died by the dozen, their strategy was working. The Veltareth, for all their technological superiority, had never faced an enemy willing to trade dozens of their own vessels to damage a single enemy ship. They had never encountered a species that would sacrifice their entire merchant marine to buy time for their military. On Earth, Admiral Voidborn was coordinating humanity's desperate gambit from the Geneva Command Center. Reports flowed in from across the system. The Mars colonies had launched their atmospheric processors as kinetic weapons. The Jupiter mining stations were rigging themselves to explode when the Veltareth came within range. "Phase 3 is ready," General Nightfall reported. "But Admiral, once we activate it, there's no going back." Kestra studied the tactical display. The Veltareth were adapting to human tactics, their formations spreading out to minimize damage from kamikaze attacks. They were learning, and eventually, their superior technology would tell. "Do it," she ordered. Across the Earth, massive orbital elevators began to glow. Humanity had spent a century building these structures to lift cargo to orbit efficiently. Now they were being converted into the largest railguns ever constructed, using Earth's rotation to accelerate projectiles to incredible velocities. The first salvo caught the Veltareth completely off guard. 12 tungsten rods, each weighing several tons and moving at 0.3 C, slammed into their formation. The impacts didn't penetrate their shields, but the kinetic energy transfer sent shockwaves through the biohulls that no amount of regeneration could immediately repair. More salvos followed, a steady drumbeat of kinetic death that forced the Veltareth fleet to constantly maneuver, and while they dodged, human ships continued their suicidal attacks, each one chipping away at shields and armor that had seemed invincible. Zendareth realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. In Veltareth history, an entire species choosing extinction over submission. The humans weren't just fighting, they were embracing annihilation as a weapon. For the first time in 7,000 years, a Veltareth fleet was being forced to retreat. The retreat should have been temporary. Fleet Marshal Zendareth pulled his forces back to the outer system, beyond the reach of Earth's improvised weapons, to regroup and plan a proper assault. The humans had surprised them, yes, but surprise was a finite resource. Once the Veltareth understood human tactics, victory would be inevitable. He was wrong. As the fleet regrouped near Pluto's orbit, human vessels continued to harass them. Not military ships. Those were being held in reserve for Earth's final defense, but civilian craft piloted by volunteers who had answered humanity's call for pilots willing to die for their species. The cargo hauler, Endless Dream, limped toward the Veltareth formation, her hull scarred from a dozen previous encounters. Captain Nina Voidclaw had been running supplies to the outer colonies when the war began. Now she was commanding one of humanity's most effective weapons, a ship full of volunteers and enough nuclear material to sterilize a continent. "Veltareth vessel," she broadcast on open channels. "This is Captain Voidclaw of the Endless Dream. We've got something for you." The Veltareth response was immediate. Plasma beams that should have vaporized her ship instantly. But the Dream had been modified with ablative armor plating stripped from decommissioned stations, and her course was erratic enough to throw off their targeting systems. Nina's ship bucked and shuddered as plasma bolts seared past her hull, but she held course. In the cargo bay, 12 volunteers sat calmly around a fusion warhead the size of a small building, playing cards and waiting for the moment when they would become a brief, bright star. 30 seconds to impact," called out Engineer Victor Stormborn. "Anyone want to say anything profound?" "Yeah," replied Gunner Yuki Ironwill. "The Veltareth picked the wrong species to mess with." The Endless Dream struck the Veltareth cruiser. Perfect symmetry amidships, and for a moment the darkness between worlds blazed with artificial sunlight. But even as individual human ships continued their attacks, Admiral Voidborn was orchestrating something far more ambitious. The retreat of the Veltareth fleet had bought Earth precious time to implement humanity's most desperate gambit. "Operation Broken Arrow is go," she announced to the assembled representatives of Earth's governments. "All civilian populations are being evacuated to the deep shelters. Military personnel will remain at their posts." The Brazilian delegate stood. "Admiral, you're talking about turning our entire planet into a weapon. The environmental damage alone will be irrelevant if we're all dead," Voidborn replied coldly. "The Veltareth have 7,000 years of conquest behind them. We have one chance to show them that humanity is more trouble than we're worth." Operation Broken Arrow was madness given form. Every nuclear weapon on Earth, from city killers to the massive planet crackers developed for asteroid mining, was being repositioned, not to fire at the enemy, but to turn Earth itself into a trap. If the Veltareth wanted to conquer humanity's homeworld, they would have to survive its death throes. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Fleet Marshal Zendareth was learning that human determination had limits that no Veltareth strategist had ever conceived. His fleet had lost 12 vessels to what amounted to armed merchant ships. The perfect symmetry alone had been worth more than humanity's entire space navy. Yet the humans had traded it for a converted cargo hauler without hesitation. "Sir," Mir Galen reported, "our intelligence division has analyzed human communications. They're calling for volunteers for something called the Final Ride. Every civilian ship owner in their system is responding." Zendareth's mandibles clicked in frustration. The humans had perhaps 1,000 civilian vessels in their system. By Veltareth standards, they were gnats. But gnats that were willing to die could wear down even the mightiest predator. "How many more humans are there?" he asked. "On Earth alone, approximately 8 billion. The number hit Zendareth like a physical blow. 8 billion individuals, each potentially willing to die rather than submit. The Veltareth had never encountered anything like it. "We advance," he declared. "Maximum force. End this quickly." But as his fleet moved toward Earth for the final assault, Zendareth couldn't shake the feeling that the humans had one more surprise waiting for them. The species that had survived their own nuclear age, that had turned their entire solar system into a weapon, would not go quietly into extinction. They would make the galaxy remember the price of challenging humanity. The final battle for Earth began at dawn. Greenwich Mean Time, though dawn had little meaning when the sky burned with plasma fire and the aurora borealis danced as far south as the Mediterranean. Fleet Marshal Zendareth had committed his entire fleet to the assault, determined to end the human resistance before it could inflict more damage on his forces. Admiral Kestra Voidborn stood in the deepest bunker beneath Geneva, watching through quantum-entangled sensors as humanity's final gambit unfolded. Every screen showed the same story: Veltareth dreadnoughts descending through Earth's atmosphere like falling stars, their biohulls glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction. All planetary defense platforms. Fire at will, she commanded. Earth's surface erupted in pillars of nuclear fire as every hidden weapon revealed itself. The Veltareth had expected resistance, but not this. Not an entire planet transformed into a fortress. Missile silos built to survive nuclear war launched their payloads not into space, but at the descending enemy vessels. Orbital bombardment platforms that had been disguised as communications arrays opened fire with kinetic rounds accelerated by Earth's magnetic field. But the Veltareth pressed forward, their shields absorbing the barrage. They had committed to conquest, and no primitive species would deny them victory. That was when Admiral Voidborn played humanity's final card. "Execute Order Samson," she said quietly. Across Earth, seismic charges detonated in perfect synchronization. Not to destroy the planet, that would come later if needed, but to trigger every major fault line simultaneously. The resulting earthquakes shattered cities and tore apart the landscape, but they also accomplished something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They turned Earth's magnetic field into a weapon. The carefully placed charges destabilized the planet's magnetosphere, creating massive electromagnetic pulses that rippled outward like invisible tsunamis. The Veltareth bioships, dependent on neural interfaces and organic computing systems, found their coordination severed as the pulses fried their communications networks. For the first time in 7 millennia, Veltareth forces found themselves fighting as individuals rather than as a unified organism. "What have they done?" Zendareth demanded as his neural link to the fleet dissolved into static. On the surface, the human military emerged from their shelters to engage the scattered Veltareth forces. Without their technological coordination, the aliens were still, formidable warriors, but they were no longer invincible. Human forces had trained for exactly this scenario: close-quarters combat against a superior enemy, using every dirty trick that millennia of warfare had taught them. Colonel Jax Doomforge led the assault on a crashed Veltareth cruiser outside Moscow. His troops were armed with weapons that would have seemed primitive to the aliens: chemical explosives, kinetic firearms, and close combat weapons that required the user to get within arm's reach of their target. But humans had been perfecting the art of killing each other for their entire history, and now they turned that expertise against Earth's invaders. "Remember," Jack shouted to his troops as they breached the alien hull, "they're used to fighting at range with energy weapons. Get close, stay close, and make every shot count." The battle inside the cruiser was brutal and personal in a way the Veltareth had never experienced. Their plasma rifles were useless in the cramped corridors, while human soldiers slipped through the darkness with night vision goggles and weapons designed for urban warfare. Similar battles raged across the globe. The Veltareth found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage on their terms, that turned every crater into a fortress and every piece of debris into a weapon. In orbit, the remaining Veltareth fleet watched helplessly as their ground forces were systematically destroyed. Zendareth could bombard the planet from space, but that would destroy the very prize they had come to claim. And even as he considered his options, human ships continued their suicidal attacks, each one carrying enough firepower to cripple a cruiser. The cargo vessel Final Stand was the last ship in humanity's civilian fleet, commanded by Captain Torres, Nightstorm, and crewed by volunteers who had lost everything to the invasion. As she guided her vessel toward the Veltareth flagship, Torres opened a channel to the enemy fleet. "Fleet Marshal Zendareth," she said, her voice carrying across space with the calm certainty of someone who had already died. "My name is Captain Torres Nightstorm of the Terran Merchant Marine. I want you to remember that name because I'm about to teach you something about humanity. And what is that, Primitive? We don't know how to quit." The final stand struck the Eternal Dominion. With the force of a small star going nova, the explosion was visible from the surface of Mars, and when the light faded, the flagship of the Veltareth 7th Fleet was breaking apart in a cloud of superheated plasma. In the silence that followed, Admiral Voidborn's voice echoed across all frequencies. "This is Admiral Kestra Voidborn of the Terran Defense Force, addressing the surviving Veltareth vessels. You came here expecting to add another species to your collection. Instead, you've learned something that 7,000 years of conquest never taught you. Some prey fights back." Fleet Marshal Zendareth, transferring his command to a surviving cruiser, stared at the tactical display showing the wreckage of his once mighty fleet. Half his vessels were destroyed or crippled, his ground forces were being systematically annihilated, and the humans showed no signs of surrender. For the first time in Veltareth history, a fleet marshal gave the order that no member of his species had ever uttered in battle. "All vessels, retreat to hyperspace. Emergency withdrawal." As the surviving Veltareth ships fled the Sol system, they carried with them a message that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity had taught the apex predators a lesson they would never forget. Some species, when cornered, don't just fight back. They evolve into something far more dangerous than anything the universe has ever seen. The age of Veltareth dominance was over. The age of humanity had begun.